pretty sure that was right. If you can name the song and this Final Fantasy game that song is from, or that little snippet of guitar play, let me know. I'll give you a cookie. Yeah, so by that intro, you could probably think, hey, is he going to talk about Final Fantasy music today? No, I'm going to talk about what I like about the Final Fantasy series. Music being one of them, which I will probably just eventually have to do my top 10 favorite albums from the Final Fantasy series, or like, my favorite soundtracks. But that's probably a video for another time. But really, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is just one of those games where like everything about the game is it's fantastic. You can't just ask somebody like hey, what do you like about the Final Fantasy games, and expect them to just tell you, like, give you a short sentence like yeah, they're cool, or I like the music. No, there's a lot to like about the Final Fantasy games. So this is really kind of me at telling you guys what I like about the series and what draws me to the series every time they release something. Because granted, Final Fantasy, it probably isn't, how would I put it? It's not, they haven't really put out main titles like they used to. You've had 13. 14 is an online game. I still think 14 is amazing. For people who get a chance to play 14, you need to play it. So I'd really say like the main titles that have been released is probably 13 and 15. Like those are the two, with like in between sequels for 13 and a lot of Final Fantasy 15 content. There's just a lot. But I'd say that there's all the soundtracks for the Final Fantasy games. No matter what Final Fantasy game you're playing, the moment you start that startup screen for Final Fantasy, it's always a blank background and like a logo, or just it's really cool. Now, I do like how the Final Fantasy title screens come up, and one of the best thing that you're greeted to, I think, for anybody, if you're a newcomer or you're a returner of the franchise or something, it's awesome to kind of get that welcoming, just home screen for each Final Fantasy game. You can always have a memorable just experience like on that startup screen for Final Fantasy. Let's just say Final Fantasy 6. You have like the lightning, the thunder, it's starting up on the Super Nintendo, and it's like this. They have the organs playing, the organs or the synths or something. I think it's the organs. Or if I'm mispronouncing the instrument, I don't know. I'm sorry. I know I'm a musician. I should know the instrument, but I haven't seen many of those. I've only seen like one in person, and I don't really hear about them as a lot. They're not used a lot, but whatever. The music that's playing, like Count Dracula, and you have the lightning, and then Final Fantasy 3 pops up. Then you have the way Final Fantasy 7 starts out. You have the sword just in the. It looks like a dark room almost. I would almost say like it's almost that church or the flower scene, but there's that. You have that, and then you have the way I would say Final Fantasy 13 starts. How you just have it's just a blank white screen, and then the logo for Final Fantasy 13 pops up. You have the way 10 starts out. It looks like there's ripples in the water. It's a nice little sparkling soundtrack they used. They didn't use To Xanarkin, but I did like the way the opening cinematic kind of just showed. It showed like kind of an epilogue or a prologue of what was going to happen in the future. You weren't there yet, but you knew you were going to get there. And it was kind of just Titus telling you that, hey, I'm going to tell you a story of how I got here and everything. It was really cool how they did that. Then you have the Final Fantasy 15 startup screen, which I think that startup screen was one of those that it was so subtle, and it was just some of the best, I think, and cinematic quality. I really liked it for how the game just, it showed first off the amazing artwork that all the Final Fantasy games have, and you have the song Somnus playing with just real subtle with the piano, and I would think that they were going to use the voice for that singer, the girl that was singing Somnus in the Final Fantasy Versus 13 trailer. I thought they were going to use her, but they ended up using a violin, which I think that was a perfect choice to use to like kind of mimic the words that would come out of the woman's mouth, whoever sings Somnus. And I mean, just the title screens for the Final Fantasy series, for me, like every Final Fantasy game that I started up on, each one has had its own unique Final Fantasy you know, startup screens, including Crisis Core. Crisis Core, I think the way you have, you know, it's a simple selection screen, you know, just new game and then load game, but then you have Zack holding the Buster Sword, and you have like these feathers falling, you know, kind of representing that, like the angel or like the wings that they get later on in the game. It was really cool to see that kind of effect, and you have Midgar in the background. I think that's probably like one of my favorite title screens with the subtle, uh, again, piano playing. It was just piano actually, just the piano playing the burden in the background. And I think the soundtrack is really what makes the Final Fantasy games more unique, along with the characters. The characters really, I think, they complement like the soundtrack. Everything that I feel, it's the soundtrack. Without the soundtrack, Final Fantasy wouldn't be what it is today. Because if you ask anybody what they like about the Final Fantasy games, you can have people just say, "Oh yeah, I hated the Final Fantasy game," but no one's gonna walk away telling you, "Hey, I hated that soundtrack," or "Never mind." Unless it was Lightning Returns. It's not that I hated it. I just did not like some of the soundtracks in there. I do think it was a little bit weak though. But coming from the main Final Fantasy titles, they were pretty much all good, all of them. Now, like I said earlier, the characters, they really add a lot to the feel of the game, because the music can tell one story, and the characters, they tell another. You know. The characters in the Final Fantasy games are also something that are pretty unique, along with their plot lines, because some of the stories that are, you know, told in the Final Fantasy games, some of them, I think, like the older ones, they were real edgy. I mean, I haven't seen any stories like them like now, but back then, I just think that the stories, they stood out more. They're really memorable. I mean, you can't tell me that Final Fantasy VI has a less memorable story than, I don't know, the latest Call of Duty game or the latest Mass Effect game, because really, no, I haven't seen any games tackle storylines the way Final Fantasy has. You have other games that have unique stories, like Persona. The Persona series is great. Lunar, you have Vagrant Story. There's a lot of games they have, you know, great stories, but there's some charm to the Final Fantasy stories that just, I don't know why, but I guess just the characters they put in it, the music, and you know, everything they add to the game, it just makes it so well. It makes just such a unique game, and the world that they create in the games. Final Fantasy 13 is one where I feel like the characters, I do think they were pretty underrated. I did enjoy the cast of characters. It almost felt like they were like, you know, kind of the Avengers in the Final Fantasy universe, in the fact that, you know, they all had their own thing going on, and they all just kind of ended up in the same place, but they were strangers. But you see the relationship grow between these strangers, and they all have different paths. It was a really, I feel like they should have put more time into the game, but I think that it was a pretty solid entry into the Final Fantasy series. Along with the characters, without the music and the characters, it just, I think the worlds in the Final Fantasy games, there's something really memorable, you know, about them. Like those simulate the. I mean, you have the Golden Saucer mini games in Final Fantasy VII, or you know, Mount Nibelheim. You have, you know, Cocoon from Final Fantasy 13, 15. You have almost that entire world was just great, especially the dungeons. I think the dungeon in Final Fantasy 15 were probably done better than any other Final Fantasy game. Like, you know, I guess the current gen ones, like the HD ones, because they were already preloaded in, and they just felt like, you know, it just blended in so well together. Final Fantasy 12, I mean, I think that game is really underrated. If you haven't bought that one, I think you should. It's on the PS4 right now, but it's definitely something that you need to check out. You've also had, I mean, like I said, the characters, the worlds, the music have always been fantastic. And not only that, but I think Square Enix, they've done really good jobs in expanding some of their universes. They haven't done a lot with many of the Final Fantasy games, but I think the times that they have done jobs where they expand the universes of their games, like specifically the individual titles, I think they've done a pretty good job. For instance, I'm gonna just say the Fabula Noble Crystallis series. I'm gonna count that as like Final Fantasy, the 13th series, 15, and then Type 0. You could definitely see, I mean, later on they did kind of disband that entire thing, I think, but you can definitely see the similarities in that universe, that shared universe between all those games. And hey, Final Fantasy X, X-2, and Final Fantasy VII, and their like prequels or whatever expanded universe they have, like Dirge of Cerberus, they did a pretty good job starting it out. I mean, Final Fantasy VII was one of those that it had its own universe, and is definitely one of the more interesting universes I've seen. But it's just how they did it with their, you know, their prequel. I think that is probably one of the best prequels to a video game I ever played, was Crisis Core. You know, and what I think Yeah, I think that's probably the best prequel I've ever played. Between Crisis Core, then you have the Yakuza 0 and Halo Reach. There's very few prequels out there that do a really good job at exploring more in the world that they created and, you know, just the characters and their past. And I think Final Fantasy 7 and or like Final Fantasy series, the times that they've tried exploring their different characters and the worlds, I think Square Enix has done a pretty good job at expanding the lore between all these different games. Like I said, you have the Final Fantasy 7 games. They have their own like universe. You have 10 and 10-2. They expanded more on the universe, and they even showed that they shared a connection between 7. Uh, Later on, I believe it was Final Fantasy Tactics. That one was connected with 12, if I'm correct. If it was not 12, then it was 11. And they expanded more upon that. You know, just there's a lot of different things that I think that if Square Enix, if they did more sequels to their main titles or like prequels or some spin-offs, I think they could really build up smaller universes in these games. Not to mention the entire series, they do kind of share a universe, and the fact that they're across different dimensions. There's a whole theory on that. Like, if I can like write down, I'm gonna start writing stuff down as I play through the games. That I could like maybe make up my own theory one day. But specifically, the things that link all these games together are the summons, and these summons, it's very small nods, very small. But sometimes you'll get a summon that they'll speak words in like the older games with the text and everything, and you'll be able to recognize that some of these events that these characters talk about, they reference older events that happen in like Final Fantasy games that just you really have to be a veteran to like even get any of those references. It's really cool, but I think those are great nods to the game. And there's a lot of things I can just point out, like, you know, things I like about the Final Fantasy series, be it the characters, the story, the you know, just the worlds, the bosses, the enemies, the battle styles. There's so much because they're all great treats. But in the end of the day, I think what drew me more towards the Final Fantasy series was its music, and that's really what made me like a hardcore musician, was just listening to all the arrangements by these by the composers of the entire series. But really, guys, there's a lot of things I can go on about. I mean, just Final Fantasy series in general. I think it's really helped a lot. Like, it's definitely helped. Like there's definitely a lot of things I do enjoy about the Final Fantasy series. I can't pinpoint like every single little small detail. There's just a lot. But if you guys have to ask me like, what do I like about the Final Fantasy series the most, I would have to say that straight up, my most favorite thing about every Final Fantasy game, it could be bad, it could be the best Final Fantasy or whatever, it has to go to the music. Because the music, like I said just previously, I think just the last little comment or snippet I just did a little while ago, the music is really what drew me to the Final Fantasy series more than anything. The stories and his characters were just additions or like bonuses, but the music and those moments those music points, like just the cinematic quality that the music has and the stories that the music tells by itself, I think that it's unmatched with any other game. Because I could be listening to a soundtrack and it's almost like from the Final Fantasy games, I can hear any song from the Final Fantasy games and you can tell what the artist is feeling, the composer. You can hear stories through the music, the tones, the keynotes that the composer hits with, whether it be pianos, strings, whatever it is. You can tell the type of feeling that the composer has and what story they're telling through the music. And I think in the Final Fantasy games with the PlayStation era of games, the music was probably some of the best the series has ever seen. It is really amazing. And along with the spin-offs that happened later on down the series, it was amazing. But I think where it shines really the most was the spin-offs, not the spin-offs, the main series in the PlayStation games or the PlayStation 1 games, PSX or whatever. I think that the music told stories because back then there wasn't voice acting a lot. You had voice acting for games like Metal Gear Solid or Resident Evil, but Final Fantasy, they didn't introduce voice acting until Final Fantasy X. That was like the first voice acted Final Fantasy game. And until then, Squaresoft at the time, they had to rely a lot on their music to kind of tell these stories, and it almost felt like you were watching a wonderful play. It was a beautiful play, whatever they were showing, whether it be just, you know, them showing someone's death, or hey, maybe, you know, war happening in a game, or hey, Vivi, those moments with Vivi and just Zidane, there are moments like those that they just capture a lot of that, you know, cinematic quality, or like just that quality of music that you can tell the music is telling a story and it's speaking for the characters. But really, that's what I like most about the Final Fantasy games. What do you guys like? Let me know in the comment section below what drew you guys to the Final Fantasy games. Tomorrow is going to be the last day for the week of Final Fantasy. I did get slow on uploading like this middle of the week, but that's because for some reason YouTube is messing up. It just hasn't been uploading my videos. It's weird. Like I'll upload it, but then it doesn't upload. I don't know what happens, but I'll work on it. I'll see what's going on. But anyways, thank you guys for watching, and remember to like, comment, subscribe, upvote. Well, god dang, I keep on saying upvote if you're watching a VidMe. VidMe's gone, guys. I'm sorry. I'll have to do a video on that later. But remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you guys, again, what you guys like most about the Final Fantasy series. And if there's any more content you'd like to see me do, be sure to let me know in the comment section below, or any gaming topics you want me to talk about. But this is the Power Up Mushroom, guys. And remember, when you guys are gaming, power up.